Hello, this is Dr. Chuck Gazer with the Sheep, Goat, Cervid, and Equine Commodity, and today I'll be covering the guidelines for our portion of the cooperative agreements for this year. First of all, I'd like to thank everyone for your continued and successful efforts to eradicate scrapie. Our last case of classical scrapie was in April of 2016. We know there are still flocks out there that have not been tested, and there's probably scrapie hiding away somewhere in your state. But once we declare freedom, we will have 7 years to prove our freedom, so that surveillance will continue for an additional 7 years. Basically, this presentation is the same as last year, except I've updated a few of the slides with more current information and one slide for an additional policy change that we'll discuss shortly. Next slide, please. First off, I'd like to say that there are no cooperative agreement funds allocated for cervid or equine species. Any specific request for these species will be evaluated on a case-by-case basis. Next slide, please. One policy change that occurred this year is that the National Scrapie Eradication Program can no longer provide or no longer has the funding available to provide free official plastic ID and applicators to producers and others. The only thing we can afford to provide are free official metal ID without the applicators to producers. We may be able to provide a limited amount or limited number of applicators to concentration points and markets if they're new to using these metal IDs. Cooperative agreement funds cannot be used to purchase plastic or RFID tags for sheep and goats. That question popped up immediately once that new policy went into effect, and unfortunately we cannot fund those. Our cooperative agreement funds for sheep and goats will be used for surveillance, disease management, ID compliance, and education and outreach. We know that the conversion to metal tags will have some negative effects, including the potential for injury to shearers, and they're difficult to read for management purposes for the producers or for recording ID at concentration points. It will also most likely reduce some of our ability to trace animals. Again, this is all budget driven, but producers can still purchase their own plastic and RFID official IDs if they would like to, using their own funds. So what can this funding, next slide please. So what can this funding be used for? Under our sheep and goat surveillance objectives, we can use it to investigate and sample scrapie suspect sheep and goats. This is a high priority for our program because these are the animals that have the best chance of being positive for scrapie. So we should do everything we can to locate these animals and to test the animals where possible. It can also be used to collect all targeted animals at our RSSS sites, which are our regulatory scrapie slaughter surveillance sites, used to maintain current and add new RSS sites, and to increase surveillance of targeted sheep and goats. As a rule, our targeted sheep and goats, of course, as we mentioned earlier, are those that are clinical suspects. Also, any adult animal or animal 2 to 5 years of age with official ID, and this goes for goats and white-faced sheep. There's an exception for black-faced sheep. In that case, we can collect samples from any mature black-faced sheep with or without official ID. Also, the objective is to meet the state of origin-based surveillance sampling minimums for sheep and goats. And we'll talk more about that in just a little bit. Next slide, please. Our surveillance goals are to increase our overall surveillance for scrapie in the United States, especially in those flocks that have never been sampled or parts of each state which are underrepresented. To conduct this scrapie surveillance is conducted in accordance with VS Memo 557.11. All regulatory collectors who collect sheep and goat samples or blood samples for genotyping should enter those samples into VSLS, which is a Veterinary Services Laboratory Submission System. This expedites the submission of samples and resulting of those samples and tracking of samples. Samples should be submitted within 1 week of collection. The reason for this is that formalin in long-term storage will cause damage to the DNA. If we get a positive scrapie sample, we may be unable to identify the genotype of that animal, which would require us to potentially take all animals in the flock or re-genotype the entire flock, since we don't know the genotype of the positive animal. All payments for testing are made through veterinary services contracts, not through cooperative agreements. The reason for this is that we have large volume contracts in place, which inevitably will be much cheaper to use in place of local contracts being put in place. Next slide, please. All investigations of scrapie suspects must also be entered into the Scrapie National Database. That is SCS. We call it SCS for scrapie. It is a single national database. It is not the same as a local state SCS. This also can serve as a permanent record repository for records dealing with the scrapie program. We have approval. We have received approval to maintain all of our permanent documents for the scrapie program, referenced to individual flocks and slaughter plants and livestock markets in SCS as our permanent repository. All EPI investigation reports must be submitted through your designated scrapie epidemiologist for the state. And after the DSE reviews it, then that is sent to the national epidemiologist for review. And again, the primary reason for this is to verify that the investigation was completed properly, that a flock plan, if needed, is instituted properly, and that there are no problems that may pop up down the road. Also, the EPI reports are required to be completed by DSE, the National EPI, and are used as part of the quarterly EPI report, and to verify that all investigation requirements have been met. Next slide, please. The state sampling minimums for your state for sheep and goats can be found in Appendix A1. The new scrapie regulations, if approved, would require each state to meet the state of origin surveillance sampling minimums for sheep and goats in order to remain a consistent state. That rule has not been passed yet and has been in clearance for over a year. But if it is passed, it will have that new requirement. States that did not meet their surveillance minimums for fiscal year 2017 should include those activities to address this part of the cooperative agreement. Next slide, please. This is an example of the sheep and goat sampling minimums for 2018. Basically, these are developed based upon the last NVSL confirmed cases from your state, as well as the NAS census on number of breeding ewes within your state, or breeding does within your state. If the state has a better, more accurate source of information on the breeding population within the state, they can provide that, and we can use that in lieu of the NAS census document. Next slide, please. Reports are required on a quarterly basis through the AD and to the commodity agreement team. Include only work that is completed by the state. If the scrapie program in the state is managed by a state DSE, clearly separate the work completed by the state and the federal sides. Next slide, please. ID compliance at concentration points. Use Appendix A1.1.A. It's a template that states that are not responsible for compiling the final report, And for those that do complete where you have a state DSE and are responsible for completing the final report, use the Appendix A11B template instead. Basically, you don't have to use that exact template, but as some states have different spreadsheets or other formats, as long as they provide the information that is needed on those templates, that is fine. Normally, these are reported on a quarterly basis and are included in the quarterly EPI and ID compliance reports. Next slide, please. This is an example of a table you can use to report any epidemiological investigations that you conduct within your state. Next slide, please. Appendix B5 is a table that you can use to report your RSS activities for the reporting period, showing the work that the state does in meeting our surveillance requirements. And next slide, please. Appendix B6 is for non-RSS surveillance activities. These are usually from on-farm collections or from veterinary medical diagnostic lab collections. Next slide. One of the options for using cooperative agreement funds is for education and outreach. It can be used to improve and to educate producers and markets on ID and record-keeping compliance. It can be used for reporting and submitting commodity species which show clinical signs of commodity-specified diseases such as scrapie, CWD, and potential foreign or high-impact emerging diseases such as TB and brucellosis in these species. It can be used to educate producers and others to submit any found dead mature animals and goats for scrapie sampling, for producer awareness and the benefits of genotyping and other strategies to prevent scrapie within their flock or herd, and lastly, to attend district-level sheep and goat scrapie training. This training is held once a year in alternating districts in the east and the west. In this year, it's going to be held in District 5. I believe that was in Idaho. The purpose, again, you should, this district-level training was developed to try to decrease the cost of sheep and goat health training, and it's held in alternating districts so that hopefully most folks will be able to attend the training by driving and won't have additional costs for flying and other costs to attend that training to save money. Next year, this training will be, in 2019, this training will be held in District 1 in the East. That is all I have today. If you have any questions or concerns, please contact your supporting national scrapie epidemiologist in the East. That is myself. My phone number is 919-855-7252. And in the West, for Districts 4, 5, and 6, that is Diane Norden at 970-494-7371. Thank you.